Yeah, we want to apologize ahead of time for the really boring political presidential cycle that we're looking at so far. We hope we can keep everybody awake. I don't really need to introduce my distinguished panel, but that's really my only job. So I have, to my left, Bob Walker, who's the chairman of Wexler Walker. And then we have John Allen, head of content and community for Sidewire. Jeanne Cummings is the political editor for the Wall Street Journal. And last but not least, Cheri Jacobus is president of the PR firm Capitol Hill Strategies. Now, I think last time we were here, every single panelist was asked who would be the toughest candidate to go up against Hillary Clinton. And unanimously, everyone said Marco Rubio. So we're just going to start out saying, we're not claiming to be omniscient here, but I want to ask you guys what happened and where do you see this leaving the Republican field at this? So we'll start with you, Bob.
Well, first of all, a disclaimer, because I'm an activist on the John Kasich campaign, and so we have to take a little bit with a grain of salt where I am. But I think what really happened was that we had a sort-out process that was largely dominated by Donald Trump's coming into the campaign. And I think that what he did was brought a 21st century campaign to a campaign where most people had calculated it on 20th century standards. So that the moment that Donald Trump could dominate every news cycle by tweeting something in the morning, and dominate at least that day and perhaps several days after, where all of the candidates were being asked to comment on Donald Trump's tweet rather than on what they were trying to do themselves, has changed the whole dynamic of the campaign.
Yeah, I mean, I think the congressman's right. I sort of think of it as, if you look at all those traditional candidates, all of them in their own ways tried to straddle that traditional line between being the moderate and the conservative, a little bit between being establishment and getting along with people inside and being an outsider. They straddled those traditional lines, and then Donald Trump tossed over the board and scrambled all of the voters and scrambled all of the other candidates and said, hey, I'm a magnet with these positions, come to me. And was able to get, whatever, 35% or so. I don't think he would be able to beat any of the Republican candidates in a one-on-one, had it been one-on-one from the start. But 35% is good if you get 17 candidates.
Now, Jeanne, we're looking at New York and the delegate hunt, and so what do you think the odds are that Trump is going to manage to get his delegates?
I think the odds, it is plausible. If you look at the map ahead, he's got some friendly territory in front of him, and so he should perform pretty well in the next 5 or 6 races. Then the map goes back west again, where Cruz can rise once more in Indiana and Nebraska. So it's hard. It's plausible, but it's very hard. And I think the odds are not necessarily in his favor, that he can get the 1,237 bound delegates. And then if he doesn't win on the first ballot and we go to a contested convention, then I think the momentum swings to Cruz. I don't think an outsider or a third person like Paul Ryan is likely to be introduced in this mix, because you hear from the candidates and you hear from many members of the Republican leadership that if you're going to become the presidential nominee, you need to go out there and run for it. And I think that if you look at public polling, most Republicans agree with that as well. So, I mean, that's kind of the craziest scenario, which is called job security for me. So we're counting on that. But it's not impossible for Trump to do it. He just has to win by really big margins, and we have to see if John Kasich can show again. In New York, it's funny, Ted Cruz has framed the debate and set the standards. If Donald Trump doesn't get over 50% in his home state, it's a big loss for him. That's the way Cruz has framed it. Nobody has disputed that. Trump hasn't pushed back. So that's the standard that we're looking at. But it's John Kasich, who has to show to try to keep Trump from going over 50%. So this is a huge test for John Kasich.
Now, Cheri, why don't you talk a little bit more about what we're looking at in New York? I was on the way over here. NPR had, Ben Ginsburg and Bob Bauer and all these people talking about the trickiness of New York, especially for the Republicans.
Right, and I am a New Yorker now. I lived in Washington for 30 years. I've been in New York for 3. The way they do this in New York and why that 50% is so important is that you have to have 50%. It's kind of a winner-take-all. They do that. You have to have 50% in each of the congressional districts. That's what Trump would need to get to get all 3 of the delegates in each of the 27. If he falls below that 50%, even if he comes in first, which he will, he doesn't get all 3. Then it gets a little bit different. Then we have a little bit different situation where Kasich, if he's above 20%, he gets some of those delegates. So the 50% mark in New York is not just a psychological loss, which it would be should Trump not get that, but it is a real thing. 50% is what you need to get all 3 of the delegates in each of the 27 congressional districts. So it's very important. Then they've got these 14 sort of wild card delegates that can go anywhere. They also changed the rules in New York where the delegates now are freed up after the second ballot. So it's not just what you see this Tuesday coming up in terms of how Republicans vote in the state of New York. You have to look at this May meeting where they're fighting now for the delegates. So you've got Cruz, you'll have Kasich, and Trump fighting very, very hard to make sure that the delegates stick with, Trump wants, he wants the 50%. He wants to win those delegates. More importantly, he wants to make sure they'll stick with him on a second ballot in Cleveland. So there's a lot more going on than just a straight up popular vote. And you're going to see this throughout. I think it's going to be hard for Donald Trump to get to that 1237. I think if he doesn't have 1237 going into Cleveland, he does not get the nomination. So all the haranguing and the whining and everything that you hear, there's a lot of frustration, but people are now becoming educated on the primary and caucus process and how we actually choose our nominee in the Republican Party. So I think it's a great civics lesson for people, even if they don't like it. They knew the rules, or they should have known the rules. All the campaigns were, and you've got candidates now are showing the delegates who actually choose them in Cleveland this summer, that it's more than just going out and getting media and getting the popular vote. You're slogging through these states. You're winning over the delegates. You're working at the very grassroots level. And that's what the delegates choosing a nominee really want to see. The second thing is that they're going to see who can beat Hillary Clinton. Right now, John Kasich looks like he's the guy that can do it. Some people argue that he hasn't really been hit with a lot of opposing media, so maybe he hasn't been vetted in that way. I would argue that he's been around forever. We've all known him. Those of us who've worked with him in Congress, and he's been in the public eye for a long time. But Ted Cruz at this point, in my view, has to show, yes, we know he can go through and get these delegates. He's got the organization. And he's also winning over a lot of people in Washington who never liked him before. But now he's got to show that he can beat Hillary.
Now, Bob, she's brought up your guy. What kind of path does he see? I mean, especially because you do have these rules where you have to have a certain number of delegates from at least 8 states, and he hasn't cleared that hurdle, and he's got a rough haul in front of him. Kind of, how does this work for him?
Well, for Kasich, part of our plan all the way along has been to get to the Northeast, and he's running second in a number of the polls now in the Northeast. And in Pennsylvania, where I'm deeply involved, I'm the chairman of the Pennsylvania campaign, we've been looking at a lot of the polls coming out of the individual congressional districts and out of the Senate race. And it shows that the race there is basically 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, which means that he has an opportunity to actually win in Pennsylvania, even if it's a marginal win. But that would give him some of the delegates, statewide delegates in Pennsylvania, as well as delegates coming out of the
He grew up in
congressional.
Pennsylvania.
He did. He's a native Pennsylvanian, and so that has some appeal connected with it. But beyond that, he's shown up pretty well in some polls in Maryland. He's shown up fairly well in Delaware. I mean, there are some states where he's going to have a little bit going for him. If you look at where, as was mentioned by Jeanne, where you go west, the fact is that Washington and Oregon are actually better for us than they are for Ted Cruz. In California, Northern California is actually pretty good for Kasich. And so you put all of that together, he probably comes up at the end of the day with something in the order of 400 to 600 delegates that will be possible for him. That will put him in third place going into the convention. But in the convention, this whole business of who can beat Hillary, it becomes a very important piece. There was a survey out just yesterday that was done of all 50 states, polled 44,000 people across the country, and Kasich was the only one who gets an electoral vote. In other words, Cruz and Trump both lost to Hillary in the electoral vote college. John won fairly handily in the electoral college. That will have an impact on the people in Cleveland, in large part because they look not only at the candidate, but they look at the impact on what we call the down ticket, the rest of the candidates that will be running. And in that case, John has a pretty good story to tell.
Now, John, we've been talking about delegates, and there's been a lot of whining from Trump about how the whole system is rigged, and there have been some Sanders supporters as well who have been complaining about this. Do you see this as becoming a problem for either team? I mean, kind of where do you see this issue going?
I think whoever's losing always complains about the rules or the refs. It's like watching an NCAA championship game, and occasionally the team that's winning does it too, but usually it's the losing team that's working the refs. Look, the parties have their nominating processes, and unless the parties feel that the public pressure within their party on them is, something that requires them to change how they go about business, I think they will do it the way that they intend to. I mean, the parties choose their nominees. Bernie Sanders all of a sudden woke up yesterday and decided that there were superdelegates, and maybe that should have been fixed. I mean, the people who say he should have joined the Democratic Party are right if he had wanted to fix it. I think the same thing with Trump. There are rules that the Republicans have had and had for a long time. By the way, both parties have had for a long time. When you don't get a majority of the delegates, you move down, you keep having votes until somebody gets a majority. So one thing I would say about that Rule 40B that was referred to earlier about getting 8 states, I was talking with Governor Barber from Mississippi the other day. He was actually on our app at Sidewire talking about the conventions, and his view was that just because you haven't gotten 8 states doesn't mean delegates can't vote for you on the floor.
It's a majority of the delegates of 8 states. So, for instance, in the second ballot, the eight states could switch from where they were on the first ballot, and you could be nominated on the second ballot, even though if you weren't nominated on the first.
And his overall view was basically any of these candidates could end up winning the nomination. That is not going to prohibit or preclude John Kasich or any of the other candidates from getting a majority.
Jeanne, you
want
to jump in?
Well, I think you all are getting the first inkling of the next fight. And that is, what does that rule mean? The first meeting at the convention typically is the Rules Committee. And there are varying interpretations of what the rule for who can be nominated, what it actually stands for. The rule was put in place in 2012 to stop Ron Paul. So it was put in by the Romney camp, and that's where they set that standard. So it's not like it's some big historic tradition or that it has some grand constitutional, rich meaning. It was a political tactic and an arbitrary decision on what bar would Ron Paul not cross, and that became the bar. So the next fight, though, is going to be over what that rule really means.
Okay, so then you look at how into the weeds the candidates are having to get in all this. And my response to this and my question to all of you is basically 2 words. Donald Trump. I mean, he hasn't followed any of the rules, and he has no real kind of motivation to continue following the rules. What are the odds is if he doesn't get his way at the convention, we wind up with a 3rd-party race or 3-candidate race?
Well, you can't get his name on ballots. It's too late.
He'd be a spoiler. That would be it.
He could try, but he can't. I mean, deadlines have passed.
it's one of those things where he made his pledge that he was going to support the nominee, but no one ever really thought he was going to do that. And the question has always been, how much trouble will he cause if he is treated unfairly by
I find it
the party?
surprising that anyone thinks there's any question that Donald Trump isn't going to be causing trouble. He's going to cause trouble every time he speaks. He's been doing it from the beginning. And this is something, and some people aren't going to like hearing this, but from the very beginning and in the summer, we all thought this Donald Trump was a joke and that it would go away. But the one thing we weren't counting on was right-wing media, those of us who are right of center, whether you're far right or just slightly right of center, we rely on right-wing media to give us information about candidates, about politicians from both sides. And I think that we were all caught flat-footed, especially the other candidates, by the fact that so many powerful right-wing media figures were supporting Trump. And people thought, well, it was just for ratings, and which it was, and the mainstream media did that too. And I thought there should have been some serious conversations in newsrooms across the country over that, and I said that publicly, and I said that on CNN, and nobody liked hearing it at the time. But then it got a little bit scary. Once we got into August, we got into September, and I think that a lot of the right-wing media figures thought that Donald Trump, they wanted Hillary in the White House because many of these people, and Donald Trump would help them do that, many of these people made their names, their fame, and their fortune the first time there was a Clinton in the White House. And I think many of these people have you can't sell an anti-Hillary book unless Hillary is in the White House. And I think a lot of these people really wanted the ratings, the book sales, the clicks on their websites, and they knew exactly what they were doing. And that makes me a horrible person in some quarters for saying it, but I'll say it anyway.
Now, do you all assume Hillary is going to be the nominee?
Yes.
I do.
Yeah, I do. I will say that the Justice Department activities are an issue. I don't believe that Hillary will be indicted. I believe it's highly possible, though, that 3 of her top aides will be indicted. And no one's quite sure at this point how that will impact the campaign. But I think that in the end, she's the
You want to
nominee.
jump in?
Well, I was just going to say, since a couple of the ones you're talking about are actually high-level aides on the campaign as well as at the State Department, that would affect the operations of the campaign at the very least. Her policy director and her body woman are among the people who have been looked at and testified before the Benghazi Committee, et cetera. I think the delegate math for Bernie Sanders is essentially impossible. She will finish with more delegates than he does. There will be a question about whether she gets a majority just on pledged delegates, which is difficult to do because 15% of the entire pool is those super delegates who get to choose whatever they want to do. But I assume she'll end up with a higher number of pledged delegates, and that should take her to the nomination. I think it's anybody's guess as to who runs the best against her in a general election. But the one thing Kasich has going for him, I think, is that the big deals that Bill Clinton cut in the 90s that made him popular with the middle were all with John Kasich. They were the budget deals, the welfare reform. Kasich was in the middle of all that. So the things that made Bill Clinton easily reelectable in 96 are things that Kasich can claim credit for, and the other things he can bash Hillary Clinton for.
Well, here's a question in terms of the fallout, though, if the Republican base thinks that Trump has been unfairly had his, votes stolen and somebody else has been given his nomination. How does that impact turnout? How does that impact enthusiasm? Who gets mad enough over that for it to be a problem?
Yeah, it's definitely a dangerous game for the Republicans that they're playing right now, because we've looked at the numbers and turnout in the Republican primary is extraordinarily high. And he is bringing in marginal voters, some new voters. Many of them are just voters who've kind of sat out the last few cycles, and he's got them excited again. And so all of that, he can turn into some sort of force of its own. I don't see him as a uniter for the party. I can see Bernie Sanders at one point extracting what he can in the platform and in trying to maintain his movement in some form, but also endorsing Hillary and trying to bring that together. Trump's not a uniter in that sense. So I think it could have a very major impact on turnout for the Republican Party in the fall. As one Republican said recently, Cruz might lose, but Trump could break the party. And those are two very different impacts.
I think there's some mythology, though, about these people that Trump claims to have brought into the party. The fact is, if you go back to 2008, you find that there were many Republicans who moved to the Democratic Party. It was millions of them. The same thing has happened in 2016. There are Democrats who have gone over to the Republican Party. They are the Republicans who moved to the Democratic Party were mad at George Bush. The ones who have moved this time from Democrat to Republican are mad at Barack Obama. I don't think they walk away simply because Donald Trump isn't the candidate. And there will certainly be a percentage of them that will. But I think a large portion of those new voters that have come into the Republican Party are there and will remain there for the fall campaign. I happen to think that there's also a problem for the Democrats on this, because a lot of those young, enthusiastic people who have been turning up at Bernie Sanders rallies, 27,000 of them in New York last night, are not likely to be enthusiastic about a Hillary Clinton candidacy. And so the question for the Democrats will be whether some of those people who have been actively participating in their primary process will be there in the fall.
Cheri, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, there's also a large number of traditional Republicans who have voted Republican all their lives who will sit out if Donald Trump is the nominee. So maybe the party, and this is what the delegates can figure out in Cleveland, who is more important in the long term. Do you want to lose with Donald Trump as the nominee and perhaps be in the wilderness for a very, very long time, basically have the party split apart, or if they think they would lose with Cruz or with Kasich, do it with dignity and rebuild and live to fight another day in 2020. But there is a growing Never Trump movement that the powers that be should be taking very seriously. If they're not, I think they will be very soon. So it's, who do you want, these one-time Trump people or the people who have been around forever who will also help you down ticket? A lot of people are very concerned that a Trump nomination means that we lose down ticket, your governor's races, your House, your Senate, your state races, and that would be devastating to the party. So there's some real repercussions here and some very serious conversations going on, addressing those repercussions.
I will say, though, that the Trump phenomenon cuts both ways. If he is the nomination, the map is going to be totally different. So what's a swing state will change from what we're used to in the last 3-4 cycles. So there'll be a level of fluidity to the general election that we haven't seen in a long time, and it'll be very unpredictable. In addition, we at the Journal have a story today about Democratic House members who are really concerned about the Trump phenomenon. Louise Slaughter in upstate New York had a very tight re-election last cycle. She's facing now the same person who ran against her, so a very strong Republican challenger. And Trump just went in her district, and all of a sudden, in upstate New York, 7,000 people pop out of the woodwork. That's her worst nightmare. So the Trump phenomena is as dangerous to some Democrats as it may be to some Republicans in November.
One question.
But
go ahead.
just the reality of the electoral map that I mentioned before, that was a broad-based survey, showed that at the end of the day, Trump does not carry any states that Romney didn't carry. So the map ends up being almost exactly the same as the Romney map at the end of the day in the Electoral College. And so, and that's where the problem of the Republican Party exists. Hillary Clinton will start with 243 electoral votes, based upon the last six elections. If she continues to carry those number of electoral votes that Democrats have typically gotten, and adds just a couple of states to that, she's the winner.
Now, here's a kind of broad-based question, which is, we can discuss who kind of likes Trump and who doesn't like Trump in which districts and whatever. But if we're talking aggregate, who really dislikes Trump? Women. I mean, his unfavorables with women are through the roof. How does he deal with that if he makes it to the general? I mean, how do you, it may not matter that much in the Republican base right now, but for a general election, that's quite a hurdle. Yeah,
hides.
Jeanne and Bob, you want to?
It is a major problem. It is close to a fatal flaw, because women are the majority of the electorate come November, and his poll numbers, negativity among women is over 70%. And so, you know, I am convinced that if he becomes the nominee, that come end of July and maybe before, we're going to be introduced to the brand new Donald Trump. I just think, you know, he's doing what he's got to do to get through the primary, and then we are going to see a new persona emerge for the general, and it'll be that phase in which he'll try, either by using his family, and, you know, his daughter presents very well, you know, he could try to do it that way. I mean, he is a smart guy who, you know, stepped into this with just, you know, a few people around him and shook up the entire Republican Party. This is not an easy thing to do, and he is a smart guy, and he will reevaluate where he is. Now, what tactics will he employ? I don't know what they'll be, because his biggest problem is that he's likely to be up against a woman, and his impulse to attack could also then just make things a lot worse. But it is a
John,
giant
you're clearly just dying to jump in.
I love to agree with my former editor.
Good job. Well said.
Yeah, I mean, this is somebody who remakes himself in 140 characters several times a day and gets the entire news media to jump after him. I mean, we talk about micro news cycles. This guy's the master of creating a new micro news cycle every 5 minutes. I'm not sure that everything he's done is erasable, can be deleted in such a quick manner.
David Brock is betting that it is not over in Hillary world.
Yeah, but I'm not entirely sold on the idea that Trump wouldn't be able to pivot. And my sort of frame for this entire election is that the center is going to hold. Like, after all this populism, all of the anger, that what we're going to end up with is a president who has done what presidents have done for many, many years, which is run to the center in the general election. And whether that's Hillary Clinton because she's running against a Trump who's kind of politically undefinable and doesn't move, or a Ted Cruz who is conservative and doesn't move, or if it's a Republican who comes to the middle, maybe a Kasich who starts, at least perception-wise, I think, starts more toward the middle, or if it's a Trump that pivots to the middle, or a Cruz that pivots to the middle, we're going to end up with a huge populist furor in the primary and a pretty moderate choice at the end for president, probably somebody who has campaigned as a moderate who becomes president.
Now, does this break the Republican Party? If they've had all this promise and optimism and we're going to get something different this time around, or Jeanne, why don't you address this in terms of, because it's going to happen on the Democratic side too. I mean, but what's the difference in terms of what Republican Trump voters are expecting and what Bernie voters are expecting?
Yeah, well, we've been looking at exit polls and all the public polling data, and what we have found is there are great similarities between what animates a Trump supporter and a Bernie Sanders supporter, and it's very much about economics. They're white, they're working class, they're frustrated, but their solutions are entirely different. Bernie Sanders supporters want government to step in and help fix the problems that they face, whereas Trump supporters want him to blow the government up. So their solutions are quite different. So with that respect, I think the path is a little easier on the Democratic side towards unity, although I agree with Bob that not all of these Sanders people are going to hang around if Hillary becomes a nominee. But those that seek government solutions are going to see Hillary has her own set of solutions. They just don't go as far as him. You know, he's free tuition, she's debt-free tuition. They're variations on the same themes. So it might be a little easier on that side for the party to come together, but it is really interesting to us how much the financial collapse and the slow recovery of the economy has just awakened. This is like, you know, the revenge of the working class is what's happening in this primary on both sides.
It's interesting to me. I mean, those are writ large some of the differences between the parties that we've seen develop over the years. When you talk about Sanders and Trump, even though neither one of them is what we think of as traditional Democrat or Republican, Republicans think that the government is an impediment to liberty and to freedom and the ability of people to be entrepreneurs, and they want to shrink it or get rid of it. Democrats look at the government as an impediment to more government and greater services, and at least on the Sanders level, want to blow it up so that they can make it bigger. And so it's interesting that they both want to get rid of what we have now. They want to remake what we have now, but for, as you suggest, completely different reasons.
Now, we've been talking about down-ticket ballots and what Trump would do to this, but let's talk a little bit about Ted Cruz. And I do find a sort of irony that Ted Cruz has become the great last hope of the Republican Party, considering it is not an exaggeration that he may be the least liked member of Congress, certainly of this. He has like 2 friends in the Senate, maybe. But
and he bought one of them.
That's true. So what happens if he is at the top of the ticket in terms of down ballot races and that sort of thing? I mean, if he's not Trump, but he also doesn't have Trump's advantages.
I think the nobody likes Ted Cruz thing is strictly a Washington thing. His colleagues, he did buck the system. He's an outsider. And so now I guess he has a chance of being the establishment candidate. When you've got, Lindsey Graham was hardly his best friend. And when Lindsey Graham goes out and holds fundraisers and endorses him, that's really saying something. And I think that Ted Cruz will be given credit for sort of mending those fences. You don't have to like me, but you got to be able to work with me. And that's where I think that doing this sort of slogging through this and getting these Senate endorsements is key. And I think the media, the political media, notices that. So obviously he's well liked enough out in the country because he's one of these last guys standing. So the Ted Cruz not being very likable, I'm going to say that's more of a Washington thing, and maybe people will eventually realize that you don't have to like the guy, but you do have to be a decent human being. You do have to be smart, and what we're realizing is Ted Cruz is wicked smart, and I think you'll be hearing more about that, and I think that'll particularly be important in a general election.
I think it's true that he is very smart, and the people around him are very smart. They have run the best campaign by far, hands down. But the not liking him is for real. I mean, even President Bush said he didn't like the guy, okay? And Cruz worked on his campaign and worked in his administration, so.
Well, he came out with that thing where everybody talks about who would you like to have a beer with. He's like, I'm not the guy you want to have a beer with, but I'm the guy who's going to drive you home later. So basically his campaign motto is designated driver. Ted Cruz, designated driver.
Well, the Washington Post
like
Washington Post magazine once ran a cover story on me and called me the most obnoxious man in the Congress.
I covered him in Congress. There's some truth there.
But the fact is, my constituents ignored it. So, but look, the Cruz candidacy in the fall, should he get the nomination, will be all about a theory that conservatives had for a long time, and that is that if you have a candidate who appeals to the base will turn out in large numbers and will carry you over the top. I'm not so certain that works on a state-by-state basis that gets you the electoral votes you need. But the fact is, he would be a proof positive of whether or not that particular concept actually would work.
The key for Cruz is he's got however many weeks it is now, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 9 weeks before the convention, to convince Republican delegates across the country, again, not in Washington. Most of them are from places other than Washington. Washington, D.C. has a very small delegation. He's got this small window in which he can convince them that if it's not Trump, that he's good enough, that he is conservative enough for the base and can be trusted by the Washington establishment not to do what he's done for the last couple years in the Senate, which is sink his own party for his own personal gain, which is why they all hate him. I mean, he goes and shuts down the government over Medicare, over Obamacare, when the entire party's saying, "Please don't do this. You're going to make us look terrible." And he says, "Now look, I was right. We didn't lose seats over it." but he's basically got to convince the establishment if he wants to get those extra delegates he's going to need to beat Trump on multiple ballots. He's got to convince the establishment here and across the country that he's not the guy that he was a year or two ago, or at least can be trusted to be a little bit more of somebody who listens to and works with the establishment.
Right now, before we kick it to questions from the audience, I'm going to ask the extremely tasteful question of, do you expect more kind of back and forth mudslinging like we saw with the, what was it called, the Battle of the Wives or whatever, with the Melania versus Heidi? Do you think that's done, or do you think that we can expect at least a little bit more of that as we go through this?
I hope we're done. I think that the public didn't like it. Sometimes it has an impact, but again, when you have a lot of people, outside groups, doing the work that the media was supposed to do in terms of vetting these people and their families. So it's to be expected when there's somebody who springs onto the scene suddenly that no one really knows that much about in this particular context, that they're going to try and get to know the families. So you have to let the voters decide what's off limits and what isn't.
Did you see the Heidi sit down with Megyn Kelly? How do you think she did?
I didn't see that one. I did see them last night on CNN with Heidi Cruz. I thought she was very good, very likable, very relatable. The daughters are adorable, which helps, and it helps make Ted Cruz seem more likable because his kids like him. So
This is like the outgrowth of the '92 campaign, where Hillary Clinton became somebody that could be blasted for the things she said on the trail. And to be fair, the Clintons had brought her out, two for the price of one. And so all of a sudden she became part of this campaign in a way that I think other potential first ladies before her had not. They were judged maybe on other merits than what they bring into the campaign as a political figure or as an advisor to the presidential candidate. All of a sudden, Heidi Cruz gets yanked into this race in the most ugly way imaginable, and I'm personally shocked that Ted Cruz didn't throw a punch at
Probably people would have liked.
at Donald Trump. Well, I'm not saying he should have, but maybe he would not have suffered too many consequences for it. I think that it'll ratchet back up around the convention.
Yeah.
I think we'll start to, but it won't necessarily be on television. It'll be in back rooms where people are whispering about what
Yeah.
the first lady's going to look like.
but we're going to have vice presidential nominees at that point too, and so that opens up a whole new group of people to attack and vet, or like. So you
When
gotta throw that in.
when campaigns devolve into fear, smear, and vulgarity, it doesn't do the process much good, and in fact, it diminishes us not only as a country, it diminishes us across the world.
And on that, we will kick it to your questions. If you have anything for anybody up here, we'll start in the middle here.
One thing that didn't come up in the panel is the Hispanic vote. That's key vote and will become more key over time. If Ted Cruz is nominated, does he do any better than Romney on the Hispanic vote, do you think, because of his background?
Jeanne, have you guys looked at this at all?
Yeah, we have. Cruz, it's fascinating how Cruz and Rubio have such similar backgrounds, and yet they use those backgrounds to emphasize different points. This is where Marco Rubio was the threat. He was a big threat. He was the Democrats' worst nightmare. Cruz has used his family upbringing to emphasize his faith, not his Hispanic heritage. And so he's not connected with the Hispanic community in a personal way that could have helped him. His immigration policies are as tough as anybody's. So I don't think that Cruz has the ability to do much better than Romney did. It was really the Rubio, the Jeb Bush. John Kasich might have an opportunity because he has not been, as harsh in his rhetoric and that sort of thing. So, but Cruz I don't think is one of the ones who could become a bridge.
If you saw a Cruz-Rubio ticket, which has been discussed a little bit in the last few hours, I would keep my eye on how Hillary Clinton messages to working-class whites, because I think her message changes then, and I think it gets a little bit more like her 2008 primary message against Obama.
I can't, I'm blinded.
Yesterday, a member of the RNC suggested that although the 1,237 delegate count math is very interesting in terms of looking at the horse race. That as a practical matter, if Trump comes into the convention with at least 1,100 delegates, it's going to be very difficult to deny him the nomination through some combination of, arm twisting, people being convinced to put him over the top for the good of the party to avoid a toxic level of anger and discontent. I'd appreciate your reactions to that.
Well, I think the reality of it is that if he has 1,100, that there will be an awful lot of activity between June 7th after the California primary and the opening of the convention in mid-July. I mean, a lot of the delegates, particularly those who are unbound delegates, will be under tremendous pressure from the Trump campaign during that period of time to help put him over the top. So there will be certainly a possibility that he could round up the votes during that period. I'm not so certain that happens, but if he's that close, I'd have to admit that there's at least some probability of it.
I know of no law that prevents Donald Trump or any other candidate from paying a delegate.
Yeah,
That is allowed.
Is it-
No,
I mean,
I thought that was a little bit iffy. It's
There's-
not real clear.
I mean, it's not because they don't
Yeah.
hold a public office. They hold a party office.
But they cannot take money for their vote.
Okay,
can
but they
take
can take a lot of other
weekends at
things.
Mar-a-Lago.
A golf club membership probably is
A ride on the plane to the golf course.
Yeah.
So anything but cash, pretty
Yeah,
much.
yeah. The plane to show up for a year to take them to Florida to the golf course.
Yes, that's how they'll do that. Sure.
So I think if it gets close to, I don't know if 1,100 is the magic number. I think if it's very close to 1,237, if it's 1,200, he can probably find 37 people that will come with him.
I think that 1,100 is just an arbitrary number, and here's why. Again, convention delegates are going to look at who can win, and it doesn't. There might be some who can be bought off. I'd be disappointed, but people are people. But they're going to be under more scrutiny right now. But convention delegates want to win, and if Donald Trump continues to be doing such a poor job in head-to-heads against Hillary Clinton, if women just absolutely will not support him, no matter what, if there is a huge contingency of Republicans who are never Trump, then I think that convention delegates have to look at that. Will there be some blowback from the base because they want it to be a plurality? Well, the rules are the rules, and the delegates at that convention at that point want to win. So 1,100 doesn't mean a thing if it still looks like he can't win.
I agree with that. Look, I've been a delegate several times, and delegates actually do take the job pretty seriously. For many of them, it's the one time that they're really acting on a national stage. There are people who come out of the party and have done a lot of party work, but this is their one chance on the national stage, and they actually take the role pretty seriously.
Right here.
Would you care to comment on a Trump-Cruz president-vice president, or for that matter, a Cruz-Trump president-vice president nomination?
Well, I would not. I'm going to kick it down to John.
Won't happen.
I can't envision Donald Trump being anybody's vice president. Or I think Ted Cruz would also have trouble, as Jeanne just said. I'm going to credit you with saying the smart thing you just said, which Cruz would also have trouble with that. And Cruz doesn't have to give up his Senate seat in order to, he's not up for re-election this time, so he gets to go back to the Senate. I just can't see the two of them running together, though I suppose in an effort to ascend the ladder, Cruz might take, it's an ambitious guy, so maybe Cruz would take that offer if it were there.
I don't think that's very likely. You get the negatives of both of them all in one ticket. It seems to me that gives you a bit of a problem.
Well, especially if you're running against Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
I think it would be really interesting how he would introduce Lion Ted.
It would be Lion.
It was all a misunderstanding.
And people will believe that's what he always meant.
Yeah, right. You misheard me.
So my quick question on this is, so now that you brought it up, is the negativity, and I highly think that things will go negative pretty quickly and how that will impact turnout. I mean, will that turn people off, make them go away? I mean, I know we've gone back to the Willie Horton commercials. I mean, this could be really ugly, especially with all the outside money.
Well, we've always had very tough presidential campaigns, and this isn't going to be any different. The people who get bombarded are the people in the swing states. Most everybody else barely sees an ad. So it's going to be, people don't waltz into the White House. It's a fight. It's going to be a fight. And, I don't know if it'll degrade to Willie Horton, but they're going to be, they're going to use every weapon that they've got against one another because of what's at stake. If you think about it, this is one of the biggest and most important presidential campaigns we've had in several decades because of the Supreme Court. So you have really two branches that are at stake here, and if you look at how tight things are in Congress, you might as well throw that in too.
Yeah,
so everything's up for grabs, and both parties will fight with everything they've got to try to win.
And the difference between the nuclear mutually assured destruction and political is in a nuclear war, everybody dies, but in a political nuclear war, you just have to hurt the other person more.
Well, and
So the incentive is to actually let the nukes fly.
I don't think that we're going to see, somebody has said that we'll see a new Donald Trump. I think that Paul Manafort, his newest advisor, will want that. But if there was some other wonderful, warm, intellectual, friendly personality underneath all of that, I think we would have seen it by now because it would have come in handy on more than one occasion. So I think there might be some attempts, but I find it hard to believe that if Donald Trump is the nominee and he's on a debate stage with Hillary Clinton, that we're going to see a intelligent, thoughtful, statesman-like former casino owner who's calling women names. I just don't think we're going to see a different personality. And then it would be up to the voters to decide if this hardcore negative going after Hillary Clinton is a good thing or not.
Oh, sorry.
Excuse me, just a quick observation from someone who lived in the Washington, D.C. area for many years, but for the last 25 has lived in Colorado and California and spent a lot of time out west. When you talk about the Republican Party to me, I think the rise of Donald Trump indicates the Republican Party is broken, and it has been broken for some time. And I think that one of the basic problems within the Republican Party right now is the fact that it has not reached beyond a very narrow area. And I know in talking to senators over the last few years and trying to work with them and help educate them a little bit about why their message is not resonating with voters, they don't seem to understand that you cannot be a party of no, and you cannot be a party that is so exclusionary that you promise things and don't do anything. And I think what you've got right now are people that are so angry and frustrated. And when I see so many unemployed people or underemployed people who are basically rebelling right now because they're tired of inactivity and they're tired of listening to promises that are never kept. So I think the Republican Party really is in sore need of re-examination of who and what it is if it wants to be relevant going forward after this election.
I think that in retrospect, their party overpromised in 2010. I think they overpromised in 2014, in large part by telling the voters that if you elect us, we'll repeal Obamacare, we'll do all of these various things, when in fact the potential for doing that, given not controlling the Senate for a period of that time, given not controlling the White House for any of that time, was really an overpromise that people have reacted to, and some of the anger certainly stems from that. I will say that Paul Ryan in the House is attempting to deal with that problem by laying out a program of really trying to figure out an inclusive program that the Republicans in the House, at least, can stand on. And I think there's a recognition that some of this is broken and there needs to be some fixes. The problem for us is if Donald Trump were to be the candidate, that the party would be defined by Donald Trump, and it would take us probably a decade to work us out from underneath that definition.
You know, I think that what the gentleman back there described is what gave us Ted Cruz and to a degree Marco Rubio, who was a Tea Party candidate when he ran for the Senate, from Florida. I think that Donald Trump sort of got some of that. It sort of washed over him, but let's look at where we were last summer. We had 17 people running for the Republican primary. That was the start of how this happened. Then we had a character like Donald Trump who had extraordinarily, almost 100% name ID, because The Apprentice was the top-rated show for years and years. So he starts out with that. People knew him. The media glommed onto him in the summer because of ratings, when they really are trying to compete for ratings. And nobody thought it would last, but it just kept sort of feeding off of itself. He didn't come in with an agenda. He sort of fell into it. He'd make a misstatement. So he didn't come in with this agenda that reflects what the gentleman laid out. I think that was there, but that's how you got a Ted Cruz. Donald Trump got the media, and he sort of scooped all that up and co-opted what that was. But I think that scenario is what gave us Ted Cruz and Rubio and maybe a few others.
I think Trump is the apotheosis of the Tea Party movement. They finally got their presidential candidate. We saw the 2010 election to take the House. We've seen them destroy the budget process over time. They've essentially created, as opposed to having an agenda, have a sort of a nihilistic approach to governance. And that's what Trump is running on. And I think, there are a lot of factors at play there, and obviously the economic angst is a big one of them. But what Trump has done is really sort of tapped into that vein of, we're going to break everything down. And at some level, you can look at the Republican leaders in Congress when this started to rise up, as they were trying to win in 2010. There was this big question, the first Tea Party rally on the Hill, whether John Boehner, who was then the minority leader, was going to come out with the rest of the members of Congress to greet the Tea Partiers. And not only did he come out from the Capitol to go meet them, he led the procession of members down the steps and basically embraced the Tea Party and said, if you guys are going to put us in power, we'll accept that. And we saw what that did to Boehner over time. We saw what it did to our public policy, which has been entirely frozen. I think there can be people of goodwill on both sides who have very different views of the world that actually can work together. I know the congressman was in Congress when that used to happen. Sometimes it probably was even part of some of those, despite not wanting to sometimes. So I think that's what we're seeing from Trump, is the offer of, we can break it all down. And I don't think the Republican Party is ultimately going to opt for that, and I'm pretty certain that the American public won't.
And that hopeful note is going to be our last word for the panel. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out today.